there are libraries, and then there are vaults. And beneath the ancient walls of Vatican City lies a place that most of the world will never see. A fortress of sealed knowledge, closed to all but the most trusted few. They call it the Vatican Secret Archives. Tens of thousands of documents, handwritten manuscripts, censored texts, and forbidden books lie in its depths, sealed behind miles of corridors and reinforced doors. But of all the secrets that may slumber beneath the Vatican, one name whispers louder than the rest: the Book of Solomon. To many, it's just a myth, a legend born of medieval imagination and biblical folklore. But to others, especially those who walk the shadowed path of ritual magic, it is the foundation of all grimoires. A book that does not just speak of demons, but commands them. A book that claims to give its reader authority over angels, spirits, and the invisible forces of the world. Not through prayer, not through faith, but through control. And that is precisely why it has become one of the most feared and suppressed magical texts in history. But here's the question. If the Book of Solomon truly is nothing more than a relic of superstition, a curiosity from a forgotten age, then why is it whispered that the full original version has been locked away in the Vatican's vaults? Why have versions of the book been banned, burned, and bowdlerized for centuries? And why, even today, are scholars and occultists drawn to it with such obsession, as if something in its pages is still waiting to be used? This is not just the story of a grimoire. This is the story of a battle for power. A battle between the sacred and the profane, between spiritual control and earthly fear, between a church that built its empire on divine order, and a book that claims to give ordinary mortals the power to command the very spirits of heaven and hell. Tonight, we step into that battle. And whether you believe in demons or not, you may never see the boundaries of power the same way again. Because some books are locked away not to protect us from them, but to protect those who fear what we might become if we ever opened them. To understand why the Book of Solomon is feared, we must first understand its namesake, a man draped in myth, legend, and sacred contradiction. King Solomon, the son of David, the builder of the first temple in Jerusalem. A ruler remembered in Scripture not just for his wisdom, but for his unparalleled connection to the divine. According to the Old Testament, Solomon was blessed by God with unmatched understanding, a king who could judge rightly, speak with authority, and rule justly. But within the folds of that holiness, there exists a shadow, one that does not come from the Bible, but from the countless other texts, traditions, and whispered tales that grew in its wake. By the time the medieval world had fully embraced the idea of grimoires, books of magical instruction, the figure of Solomon had already been transformed. He was no longer just a wise king. He had become a sorcerer, a master of spirits, a man who knew the names of demons and the sacred formulas needed to bind them. Entire books emerged bearing his name, claiming to reveal the secrets of his magic. The most famous of these is the Clavicula Salomonis, the Key of Solomon, supposedly passed down from Solomon to his son Rehoboam and hidden away for centuries. The key is said to contain a complete magical system. Not folk spells or simple charms, but an organized ritualistic structure capable of invoking celestial and infernal powers alike. This wasn't magic for the sake of illusion or mischief. This was power. Practical, dangerous power. The earliest surviving manuscripts of the Key of Solomon appear in the 14th and 15th centuries, written in Latin, Italian, and Greek. But most historians agree the book itself is likely much older. Its roots may trace back to Jewish mysticism, early Christian esotericism, and even older Babylonian or Egyptian magical practices. Over time, these influences were woven together into something more structured, a grimoire that stood apart for its precision and its audacity. It doesn't just instruct the reader on how to summon a spirit. It tells them how to dominate it. The text outlines the creation of magical tools, swords, pentacles, consecrated circles, and includes detailed prayers and ritual purifications that must be performed for days in advance. Every symbol must be drawn correctly. Every word must be spoken with precision. Because the book does not traffic in vague metaphors or light-hearted mysticism, it offers the reader access to real forces and demands real obedience in return. What's more unsettling is how seamlessly the Book of Solomon blends the divine and the demonic. Angels and demons are both called upon. Names of God appear beside seals used to summon spirits from the Ars Goetia. The lines between good and evil blur, as if Solomon himself saw the spiritual world not as a place of moral judgment, but of hierarchy, negotiation, and control. This fusion of biblical identity and magical authority made the Book of Solomon unlike any other. It wasn't written by some faceless occultist in the shadows. It bore the name of a biblical king. And that made it especially dangerous, because if one of God's chosen could command demons, then what did that mean for the nature of power? What did it mean for the church? As copies of the book spread, so did its reputation. It was copied, altered, translated, always under threat of condemnation. Some versions were disguised as religious texts. Others were hidden within private collections. A few were burned on sight. But they never disappeared, because the name Solomon still held weight. It promised power that came not from rebellion, but from divine inheritance. And that promise has drawn seekers to the book ever since. The Key of Solomon is not a storybook. It doesn't describe magic in allegories or symbols meant to be interpreted. It is, in every sense, a manual, a structured system of ceremonial magic laid out in clear, unwavering instructions. And that is precisely why it has terrified theologians, tempted sorcerers, and fascinated occult scholars for centuries. At its core, the book is divided into two parts. The first lays the foundation for ritual preparation, a set of strict rules the magician must follow before performing any operation. This includes days of fasting, ritual bathing, extended prayer, and abstinence. Tools must be handmade under specific planetary alignments. Ink must be prepared using secret formulas. Even the parchment must come from animals killed in a particular way. Every step is sacred. Every detail matters. One misstep could invalidate the ritual, or worse, unleash forces that cannot be controlled. Then comes the second part, the actual operations. These are the rituals themselves, and they are far from vague. The book provides diagrams of magical circles, lists of spirits with their corresponding sigils, incantations written in Hebrew, Latin, or Greek, and step-by-step guides on how to summon, bind, command, or banish entities. These are not simple meditations or prayers. These are contracts, forged between human will and spiritual forces, held together by exacting formulas. The most infamous of these operations involve conjuring spirits to perform tasks. Want to uncover hidden treasure? There's a ritual for that. Want to become invisible? That too. Seeking knowledge of the future, vengeance against an enemy, or the favor of a lover. The book claims to provide methods for all of it, but at a cost. What makes the Key of Solomon so unsettling is how clinical it feels. This isn't wild chaos magic or emotional plea to unknown forces. It's structured, legalistic, as if the spirits being called are bound by laws, and the magician, if they follow protocol, can invoke those laws like a divine attorney. There are seals that must be inscribed with the blood of a black rooster, incantations that must be repeated exactly 33 times while facing east under a waning moon. The level of specificity makes one thing clear. This system was designed by someone who believed, without question, that these forces were real and could be controlled. And for centuries, many others believed the same. But danger lies not only in the conjuration of spirits, it lies in the book's ambiguity about the nature of those spirits. Some are clearly angelic, others clearly demonic, but many fall into a space in between. Entities described as aerial spirits or elementals, whose allegiances are unclear and whose intentions may shift depending on the magician's conduct. And then there's the matter of secrecy. The book warns that revealing its contents to the uninitiated is itself a punishable offense, not by any earthly law, but by spiritual consequence. It speaks of madness, of reversed blessings, of spirits that cling to the careless like smoke. Even possessing a copy without permission from higher spiritual authorities is said to draw attention from things that do not easily forget. It's no wonder the Church took this book seriously. In a time when superstition ruled as much as Scripture, a book that claimed to bypass divine hierarchy and give humans direct control over spirits, even under the name of a biblical king, was nothing short of heresy. A threat not just to dogma, but to order, and perhaps in the Church's eyes, to the very fabric of the spiritual world. And yet, the book survived. Through secret copying, underground distribution, and oral transmission. Even as parts of it were destroyed or censored, its core remained intact. And the promises it made, the forbidden knowledge it offered, were too alluring to resist. Because the Key of Solomon is not a book about belief. It's a book about action. It doesn't ask if you believe in spirits. It asks if you're ready to command them. To understand why the Book of Solomon has been so heavily suppressed, you must understand what it threatens. The Church, particularly during the height of its temporal and spiritual authority, maintained power not only through faith, but through the monopoly of sacred knowledge. For centuries, the clergy were the gatekeepers of divine law. They interpreted Scripture, delivered judgment, and determined what was heresy and what was holy. And then came a book that claimed a mere mortal could summon angels and demons alike, not through the grace of God, but through ritual. To the Church, this was not just dangerous, it was blasphemous. The medieval and Renaissance periods were rife with tension between official doctrine and the growing undercurrent of esoteric practice. The Inquisition wasn't merely a campaign against pagans or witches, it was a campaign against uncontrolled power. And few things represented that threat better than grimoires like the Key of Solomon. You see, unlike folk magic, which was often dismissed as superstition, Solomonic magic had a structure, a theology of its own. It named spirits, described cosmologies, and laid out a spiritual hierarchy parallel to the Church's. It had its own priests, magicians, its own rituals, invocations and bindings, and its own promises of power, knowledge, wealth, influence, and protection. But the most dangerous element of all, the suggestion that a person, without a priest, without a church, without confession or sacrament, could contact the divine directly, that they could command beings who answered not to clergy, but to the one holding the book. This struck at the very heart of church authority, and so the response was swift and severe. By the 16th century, grimoires were being hunted and burned across Europe. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Church's official list of banned books, grew steadily, and texts like the Key of Solomon were placed firmly within it. Possession could lead to excommunication, or worse. Copies were confiscated, hidden, or destroyed. Monasteries purged their libraries. And yet, the book never fully disappeared. Why? Because despite the Church's efforts, the allure of forbidden knowledge only grew stronger in the shadows. Occultists continued to copy the texts by hand. Pages were smuggled across borders. Scholars began translating portions of the book into more common languages, disguising it as alchemical or philosophical treatises. And perhaps most curiously, some members of the clergy themselves began to study it in secret. There are whispers, even in Vatican records, of priests caught performing rituals of invocation. men who sought to harness the power of Solomon, not to defy God, but to wield his supposed gifts more directly. This created a paradox, one that has never fully resolved. On one hand, the Church condemned the book as heresy. On the other, it could not erase the fact that its legendary author was a biblical king, that the book often invoked God's names, that many of its rituals mirrored, in disturbing detail, Christian liturgy. The lines blurred, and in that blurred space, fear took root. Not the fear of devils or demons, but the fear of what might happen if too many people began to see spiritual power as something they could access directly, without priests, without confession, without Rome. And so, like many things the Church could not destroy, it locked it away, into forbidden collections, into private vaults, into archives buried under stone and silence. But the question remains, if the book is merely myth, why go to such lengths? If it holds no real power, why hide it so thoroughly? Unless, of course, it does. Deep beneath Vatican City lies a repository unlike any other on Earth, the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive. Hidden behind centuries-old doors and iron vaults, this collection is said to contain over 50 miles of shelving, housing hundreds of thousands of documents. Only a select few, approved scholars with specific credentials and tightly restricted access, are ever allowed inside. No public tours, no casual visitors, and certainly no curiosity seekers looking for forbidden books. This is where, according to legend, the full and unaltered version of the Book of Solomon resides, not the fragmented and censored versions that found their way into the hands of medieval magicians, not the altered copies sold in occult bookstores centuries later, but the complete manuscript, the one that was never meant to be seen. Of course, the Vatican does not confirm this. Officially, the Secret Archive is simply a historical record containing correspondence between popes, ancient papal decrees, and other documents related to church history. But unofficially, the rumors tell a different story. Whispers from former archivists and clergy speak of entire collections sealed off even from researchers. Documents too dangerous, too heretical, too disruptive to be revealed. Books believed to summon spirits, contain lost gospels, or rewrite the foundations of Christian history. Among them, it said, are grimoires so powerful they were taken off the streets and placed under permanent lock, never destroyed, but hidden. And the Book of Solomon, with its alleged ability to control both divine and infernal forces, is always near the top of that list. Some claim the Church confiscated the original during the height of the Inquisition, recognizing it as too dangerous to allow even their own clergy to possess. Others believe it was acquired centuries earlier, passed from scholar to cardinal, its pages studied in secret and then buried away when its implications became too great to risk. But why not destroy it? That's the question that leads many to believe there's something more. Because if the Church truly believed the book was false, nothing more than a heretical fantasy, why preserve it at all? Why spend the time and resources guarding it? There are those who believe the answer lies in a kind of paradox. The Church may fear what's inside the Book of Solomon, but it may also respect it, understand it, even use it. Throughout history, powerful institutions have always collected what they outwardly condemned. Banned texts were not just burned, they were read first, copied, analyzed, stored. For power is not just something to fear, it is something to control. And to control something, one must first understand it. There are theories, controversial and difficult to prove, that certain high-ranking members of the Church have studied the Solomonic tradition, not as blasphemy, but as hidden knowledge. That they see Solomon not just as a biblical king, but as a priest king, a figure who united spiritual and worldly power, the ideal balance of the divine and the earthly. And so the book remains, supposedly locked within the secret archive, a relic not of faith, but of fear, not destroyed, because its destruction might erase something the Church still wants to hold on to. Not shared, because to do so might empower the wrong people. Instead, it sits in silence, beneath layers of stone and steel and sanctified secrecy, waiting. And if the stories are true, it is not the only one. Because the Book of Solomon may be the most infamous grimoire locked away in the Vatican, but it is certainly not the only forbidden text kept from the world. There's a strange contradiction at the heart of the Book of Solomon, one that scholars, mystics, and theologians have wrestled with for centuries. How could a book so deeply tied to divine names, angelic invocations, and sacred geometry be branded heresy by the very institution that reveres the biblical figure it's named after? Why would a book supposedly authored or inspired by a man described in Scripture as the wisest king of Israel be considered so dangerous it had to be hidden away? This paradox is not easily dismissed. The Book of Solomon is filled with prayers, invocations, and rituals that invoke the names of God, the archangels, and even verses adapted from Scripture. Its operations often begin with purification rites, acts of humility, and appeals to divine authority. On the surface, this is not a book that mocks religion. It mirrors it, deeply, uncomfortably, and perhaps that's the very problem. The rituals of the Clavicula Salomonis often look like distorted reflections of Christian sacraments. Consecrated circles, sacred robes, holy water, the ritualistic use of incense and candles. Even the timing of the operations, linked to lunar cycles, saintly days, or angelic hours, suggests a spiritual structure parallel to the liturgical calendar. It's not defiance, it's mimicry. And mimicry, in theological terms, is often considered the most dangerous form of opposition, because it walks so close to truth that it risks replacing it. Some modern esoteric scholars have argued that the Book of Solomon is not a work of black magic at all, but rather a kind of hidden priestly manual, a continuation of temple magic practiced by early Jewish mystics, adopted and adapted by Christian and Islamic thinkers alike. They claim that the book was never meant to summon demons in the way popular culture imagines, but to engage with spiritual intelligences in a controlled, sacred framework. But if that's true, then the Church's efforts to suppress it take on a more troubling dimension, because it would mean the Church wasn't simply protecting its followers from evil, it was protecting its own monopoly on spiritual authority. If a layperson could invoke angels, receive visions, or manifest divine will through their own ritual effort, what purpose, then, would priests serve? What power would the hierarchy hold? Others argue that the Book of Solomon is indeed dangerous, not because it is false, but because it works, that its rituals, when performed correctly, produce real phenomena. Visions, manifestations, shifts in consciousness, and that these effects, whether psychological or spiritual, are too unstable for general use. This belief isn't limited to modern occultists. Even in the Middle Ages, there were reports of those who used the book and claimed success, along with madness, misfortune, and death. Some practitioners were said to be followed by shadows for the rest of their lives. Others were plagued by dreams so vivid they feared sleep. One tale tells of a monk who performed a summoning from the book, only to be found the next morning, alive but catatonic, staring into nothing, lips moving in silent prayer. So what is it then? A heretical text that threatens the soul? A misunderstood manual of divine communication? A sacred tool wrapped in warnings? The truth may be somewhere in between. Perhaps the Book of Solomon is exactly what it claims to be. A set of keys. Keys to a realm that exists beyond doctrine, beyond dogma. A realm of spirits, laws, and energies that obey their own logic. A place that Solomon, in his wisdom, once knew how to navigate. And perhaps the Vatican, in its fear and reverence, chose not to destroy those keys, but to hide them, to keep them under lock and seal. Not just to protect the world from what they unlock, but to preserve the power of being the only ones who hold them. Because in the end, power isn't always destroyed. Sometimes, it's just kept quiet. For a book so hidden, so heavily suppressed, it's remarkable how many stories still surface about those who claim to have encountered the Book of Solomon, or fragments of what they believe is the original. These aren't just wild tales told in hushed tones around candlelight. Some of them come from respected occultists, former clergy, even modern scholars, who dare to speak off record about what they've seen, what they've tried, and what they've regretted. One of the most infamous cases comes from the 18th century, during a time of occult revival in France. A nobleman known only as the Marquis de L, said to be a collector of rare esoteric texts, allegedly acquired a complete manuscript of the Book of Solomon from an old monastery. According to surviving letters attributed to his estate, the manuscript was bound in faded red leather, its pages covered in Hebrew, Latin, and strange symbols no one could decipher. The Marquis became obsessed with deciphering the rituals. He would spend days locked in his study, fasting, drawing circles, preparing the ceremonial tools exactly as instructed. At first, nothing happened. Then came the disturbances. Servants reported hearing whispering voices coming from his study, not in French, but in languages they couldn't understand. One night, a maid fled the estate after seeing a figure of smoke pass through the hallway. The Marquis himself was later found unconscious, surrounded by candles and chalk sigils, with burn marks etched into the wooden floor in shapes no one could replicate. After his death, the manuscript disappeared. Some say it was returned to the church. Others say it was buried with him, sealed in lead and surrounded by salt. That's only one story. In the 1960s, a former seminarian from Spain claimed in a private interview that during his theological studies in Rome, he was taken, as a kind of test of faith, into one of the outer vaults of the Vatican Library. There, he was shown a number of restricted texts under supervision. Among them was what a senior priest referred to as a grimoire attributed to Solomon, not for reading, only for recognizing. The seminarian described the book as heavy, visibly ancient, its pages made of something stiffer than paper, possibly vellum. Though he wasn't allowed to open it, he noted that its cover bore a strange symbol. Not a cross, but a six-pointed star within a circle, surrounded by Hebrew inscriptions. The priest who showed him the book warned him, "This is not theology. It is something much older. The less you touch it, the better." The seminarian left the priesthood 2 years later. He never gave his full name publicly, but his story was later cited in an underground publication on Vatican secrecy. And then there are the modern-day testimonies, online forums, occult communities, anonymous PDFs claiming to be retranslated fragments of lost Solomonic texts. Are they real? Are they forgeries? The truth is, no one knows. But among them, there are patterns, rituals that repeat across borders and languages, seals and symbols that reappear in manuscripts hundreds of years apart. Methods of summoning that appear far too coordinated to be coincidence. One occultist, known only by the pseudonym LM, claimed in a 2003 interview that he performed a modified Solomonic summoning, using a combination of prayers from the Key of Solomon and elements from the Lemegeton. He described entering a trance state where he saw a figure, not of flesh, but of presence, standing outside the circle. The figure asked him a question he refused to repeat. After the ritual, his home became filled with electronic disturbances, lights flickering, appliances turning on by themselves, and shadows moving in the corners of his vision. He eventually burned every tool he used and left the practice entirely. Of course, skeptics dismiss these as fiction, products of obsession, mental instability, or creative fabrication. But even among skeptics, there's often a hesitation, a strange reluctance to treat the Book of Solomon as mere myth. Because even if only some of the stories are true, even if only one ritual worked, one entity answered, one summoner made contact, then it means the book holds something more than ink and parchment. It means the seals and symbols are not just art. They're instructions. And if the real book, the original untouched manuscript, still exists and is locked away beneath Vatican stone, then perhaps the greatest question isn't what it does. It's what might happen if someone ever uses it properly. There are many ways to justify the suppression of a book. Moral outrage, religious doctrine, political control, even safety. But when it comes to the Book of Solomon, none of these reasons seem to fully capture the depth of the Church's silence. Because unlike other condemned grimoires, the Book of Solomon was never truly erased. It was hidden, watched, preserved. That suggests something deeper, not a denial of its power, but an acknowledgement of it. Let's step back for a moment and ask the uncomfortable question. Why would the Vatican, an institution that has burned, banned, and excommunicated for far less, choose to lock this book away instead of destroying it entirely? If it is heretical, if it is blasphemous, if it invites demonic influence, why not rid the world of it? The answer, some believe, is simple. The Church fears the Book of Solomon not because it is false, but because it might be true. Within its pages lies a system, a spiritual technology, one that doesn't require belief, baptism, or even forgiveness. It requires precision, intention, discipline. It offers the user access to powers traditionally reserved for saints and prophets, visions, manifestations, control over spirits. It effectively short-circuits the need for institutional mediation. And that, in any religious empire, is more dangerous than the devil himself. To allow the Book of Solomon to circulate freely would be to admit that the sacred can be accessed outside the Church, that ordinary people could wield the divine without a priest. That power, true, spiritual power, does not come from a pulpit, but from a circle drawn on the ground and a voice that knows the ancient names. That is the real threat. It's not about summoning demons. It's about breaking chains. This fear is not new. Throughout history, knowledge has often been hoarded under the guise of protection. Esoteric schools in Egypt and Babylon passed sacred teachings only to initiates. Medieval monks copied and preserved alchemical texts in hidden script. Even early Christians fought bitterly over which gospels to allow into the canon and which to cast out. Not always because they were false, but because they offered different pathways to the divine. The Book of Solomon, in this context, is not an outlier. It's a continuation of an ancient pattern, a piece of forbidden technology too dangerous to be destroyed, yet too powerful to be shared. There are those who believe the Vatican has attempted to decipher the original manuscript in full, that it's been studied behind closed doors, broken down, analyzed, perhaps even tested. The results of those tests, if they happened, have never been revealed. But some theorize that they yielded exactly what was feared: rituals that work, communications that opened, entities that responded. Whether these theories are true is almost beside the point, because the fear is real. And that fear is not just spiritual, it's political, it's structural. A book that grants the power to summon angels and command spirits changes everything. It destabilizes hierarchies, it decentralizes faith. It challenges the idea that the divine must be accessed through doctrine. That is why the book remains locked away. Not because it doesn't work, but because it might. And for those in power, nothing is more terrifying than the idea that someone else, someone outside their control, could speak with heaven or hell and command it to listen. Because once that door is open, it can never be closed again. So now, we return to the beginning. A book locked beneath stone and secrecy. A book rumored to contain the names of angels, the sigils of demons, and the exact steps required to speak with forces older than time. The Book of Solomon. A text whispered about for centuries, feared not just by the faithful, but by the powerful. It is said to exist, buried within the Vatican's most guarded vaults, preserved but never spoken of, shelved among forbidden manuscripts, where the light of inquiry cannot reach, and where only the select few are allowed to tread. We've explored its origins, traced its rituals, dissected its paradoxes, and heard the stories of those who dared to touch it. We've seen how it threatens the very idea of religious hierarchy by proposing a terrifying, beautiful alternative. That man, with enough knowledge and discipline, could speak to the divine without permission. But now you must ask yourself, if you were given the chance to read it, would you? Not the diluted versions sold in bookstores, not the academic breakdowns or modern reprints, but the original, the untouched manuscript, the one locked behind Vatican walls, the one that may still carry the echoes of the spirits called forth by Solomon himself. Would you risk it? Would you gather the tools, purify yourself, draw the circle, and speak the ancient words? Because if you do, understand this. The Book of Solomon makes no promises. It does not offer comfort. It does not guarantee safety. It offers power, but never without price. And some say the book is alive in its own way, that it reveals only what it wants you to see, that it opens not with your hands, but with your will. And once opened, it never truly closes again. Perhaps that is why the Church fears it, not because it contradicts their doctrine, not because it threatens their authority, but because deep down, they believe it too. And maybe, just maybe, they're right to keep it locked away. Because power, once unleashed, does not return quietly to its cage. And some books, some knowledge, was never meant to be held. So ask yourself one final time, if you found the Book of Solomon, would you dare to read it?